Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Norris, and I'm a research assistant on the Shale Innovation Project at the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs. On behalf of all of my colleagues at Ohio University, I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment of our continuing series of webinars focused on Ohio's evolving energy landscape. Today's webinar, entitled Midstream Market Trends in the Ohio River Valley, is made possible by an Ohio University Innovation Strategy grant. The innovation strategy aims to leverage Ohio University's standing as a major research institution and focus its considerable expertise in interdisciplinary research, teaching, and creative activity around major issues facing America in the 21st century. The task before us in today's webinar is to examine trends in the midstream sector of the oil and gas industry. As many of you know, in Appalachian, Ohio, resource extraction booms are followed by crippling economic and environmental busts. While each bust is unique, they're generally characterized by two main components: a local over-reliance on extractive industries and a short-sighted failure to capture the long-term value for financial and capital investment locally. This includes the ability to attract and build out a broader supply chain of industries in the region where extraction takes place. The legacy of these busts dominates the socioeconomic environment of Appalachia and impairs the region's ability to attract financial and physical capital. In order to help change this pattern, the Ohio Shale Innovation Project is using an interdisciplinary approach to study the economic, technical, and policy trade-offs that drive resource extraction, including technological innovation, pollution mitigation, capital creation, and regional economic development. As a collaboration between the College of Arts and Sciences, the Rusk College of Engineering and Technology, and the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs, the goal of this project is to develop a deeper understanding of how these issues can be aligned to help build a more robust and resilient regional economy that withstand the shocks of a downturn in the energy industry. If you enjoyed this webinar, I invite you to mark your calendars for our next session on the topic of methane regulation, which will be held on Wednesday, October 18th, from 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. A formal announcement on that webinar will be coming out soon after this one. As always, a recording of this webinar and a downloadable version of our presenters' slide decks can be found at ohio.edu/CE3. After conclusion of today's session, I have just a couple more points to make before I hand over the webinar to our panel of experts. First, I'd like to thank our strong panel of speakers, and I feel confident that you are going to take something valuable and useful away from them during this session. Second, if you have a question that you would like to submit to our panelists during the session, please use the question field on the GoToWebinar navigation pane on the right-hand side of your screen. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible during our time today. And finally, a link to a brief evaluation will be mailed to you after the webinar. So please take a couple minutes and provide us with some feedback about today's session so that we can improve future sessions. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Daniel Carney. Dr. Carney is an assistant professor of economics at the College of Arts and Sciences at Ohio University and is an expert in the field of energy economics. Dr. Carney, please take it away.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. This webinar's topic, midstream development, is one potential way to mitigate the extremes of the boom-bust cycle that Jonathan discussed by providing local value-added economic activity in the energy-intensive supply chains. In this way, the region will not be dependent solely on resource extraction. The three speakers today will help assess the possibilities for midstream development in the Ohio River Valley. To start, Kevin Petak from ICF International will set the stage with respect to shale and natural gas market developments in the region and across the United States. Kevin is the managing director of ICF's Natural Gas and Liquids Markets Group, with many years of experience in industry before starting his consulting career. The next speaker will be Chris Ziegler, Executive Director at API Ohio. Chris has over 20 years of public service experience and focuses on legislative and policy outreach in his current position. Chris will focus his remarks on shale developments in the region and regional midstream opportunities in general. The final speaker will be Jennifer Klein, President of the Ohio Chemistry Technology Council. Jennifer will discuss the links between the shale industry and the chemical industry, and how the shale boom in our region has impacted the chemical industry's economic opportunities and midstream development potentials. Prior to joining OCTC, Jennifer was managing director of the Government Affairs Department at Chesapeake Energy. Each speaker will present for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, and then, as Jonathan mentioned, we'll open the floor to questions. Again, please address or type your questions in the question interface and specify which speaker you would like to address. To wrap up this introduction, thank you to the entire team that has helped put the webinar together, particularly Jonathan here, who's going to be running the technical side of our broadcast. With that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Kevin.
Thank you, Dr. Carney, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk with you. What I'm going to do is set the stage for this panel by talking about the overall U.S. and Ohio midstream infrastructure development. And what I'll be focused on mostly is findings and results from a study that ICF completed for the American Petroleum Institute in April of this year, which was entitled U.S. Oil and Natural Gas Infrastructure Investment through 2035, an Engine for Economic Growth. Next slide, please. So I'll set the stage. What I'm going to talk about is the overall market conditions across the U.S. because they are very important, because Ohio, of course, is going to be exporting a lot of its gas in the future to markets elsewhere across the U.S. And that's why I want to set the stage by talking about those overall conditions. I'll talk about the projected infrastructure development more broadly across the U.S. and within Ohio. I'll talk about the job and GDP, or gross state product, impacts of infrastructure development within Ohio, and then I'll provide some key takeaways to my presentation. Next slide, please. So I like to usually set the stage by providing some very high-level observations about oil and gas supply development and infrastructure development going forward. And the first thing I would note is that U.S. oil and gas production is likely to continue to grow very significantly with the continued development of shale resources. We have 10 to 15 shale and tight oil resources that are being developed very actively across the continent. Of course, Ohio, it contains one of those with the Marcellus and Utica play, and that formation alone has been developed very robustly to date and currently sits at about 22 billion cubic feet per day of production. And that is a rise from 0 billion cubic feet per day back in 2007. So in a mere 10 years, the basin has grown from very little to almost a quarter, or to above a quarter, of the U.S. gas supply. Market growth is a very important enabler of oil and gas activity. Without market growth, production in aggregate would not grow, and build out of infrastructure would not be much more, or would be much more modest. And this is a point that I can't help but emphasize. Without the market growth that we'll see elsewhere across the United States, certainly the production levels that we project here at ICF for the Marcellus and Utica going forward would not happen. Export activity is a key driver of U.S. oil and gas production and infrastructure development. We see a very healthy global market for LNG evolving in the future. We see a pretty healthy market for Mexico gas exports also evolving, and that growth in those markets is imperative for growth of U.S. oil and gas supplies. Infrastructure development is an important driver of the U.S. economy, adding many jobs and contributing significantly to gross domestic and gross state products. And you'll see this whenever I present some of the numbers in our projection. The number of jobs and the gross state product benefits to Ohio are extremely significant from the oil and gas infrastructure development. And finally, infrastructure development activity fosters development of the most cost-effective oil and gas supplies, potentially saving energy consumers billions of dollars. And if the infrastructure is not necessarily developed, that means the lower cost supplies could very well be stranded, and consumers would pay much more for oil and gas over time than they would otherwise pay with the infrastructure going in place. Next slide, please. So briefly on oil production, in the API study that ICF completed, we generally show that oil production for the U.S. will rise to between 8 to 12 million barrels per day by 2035. Actually, the base case, there were two cases presented in the study. A base case, which is should be considered a more modest case for the purpose of this discussion, and a high case, which was a much more robust case for supply development and infrastructure development. The base case is fairly flat production over time. The conventional sources of gas production are generally, or oil production, are generally declining, while the unconventional sources of oil production, particularly the tight oil resources and the shale resources, are increasing very significantly over time. And the increase in the high case is much more robust, and that's the case that actually rises to above 12 million barrels per day by 2035. Domestic production will generally displace oil imports that are coming from elsewhere. Refinery runs in the cases that we did for API generally are flat to slightly up. Refinery runs are currently at about 17.5 to 18 million barrels per day in the US, and we see them rising up to the 19 million barrel per day ballpark in the longer term. Generally, the big growth of the oil supplies is coming from the Permian Basin. We see that basin alone rising to upwards of 4 million barrels per day by 2030, 2035, thereabouts. The Delaware Basin is clearly the biggest growth component within the Permian Basin. And finally, production growth of oil will generally promote significant development of new transport, that is rail and pipeline capability, as well as oil handling capability over time. Next slide, please. If I peel the onion even further, you'll see here that natural gas production grows even more robustly than oil production in the scenarios that we put forward for API. The gas production growth is generally to between 100 and 130 billion cubic feet per day by 2035. That's off of a base in the US and Canada that currently sits in the 90 billion cubic feet per day ballpark. The US production is generally in the 80 billion cubic feet per day ballpark at present. Shale resource development will account for the vast majority of the production growth. It accounts for almost 100% of the growth. Clearly, the Marcellus Utica is a big driver of the production growth going forward, since it is primarily a gas play, unlike the West Texas or Permian Basin plays, which are primarily oil plays. The market growth, as I alluded to earlier, is necessary to promote this type of production growth. Without market growth, you would not necessarily see the production growing as we projected for API. And finally, significant development of gathering and processing facilities, pipelines, and export terminals, liquids as well as LNG export facilities, will be needed to support this type of growth in gas production. Next slide, please. So on the market side of the equation for U.S. gas, we see that that the gas market will generally grow to between 105 and 130 billion cubic feet per day by 2035. Of course, that is what is driving the production growth that you saw on the prior slide. So this slide is breaking out in more detail where the market is for natural gas going forward. We see that a big portion of the growth is in LNG and Mexico exports. LNG exports in the API scenarios grow to upwards of 10 billion cubic feet per day by 2035, actually by 2025. And even in the high case, they grow to upwards or around 20 billion cubic feet per day. Mexico exports generally grow from a current level of 3.5 billion cubic feet per day to upwards of 7 billion cubic feet per day in the API scenarios. And then finally, rounding out the picture, gas-fired power generation and petrochemical gas use, particularly gas used in ethylene crackers, for instance, will generally rise as well and provide for the other half of the market growth that you see going forward in the scenarios. Again, and I keep emphasizing this point, without this market growth, and this market growth is by and large concentrated in markets outside of Ohio, you would not necessarily see the production growth and the infrastructure development that we put forward in the API scenarios. Next slide, please. So if I peel the onion even further and look more specifically at the Marcellus Utica, and this slide shows information from our current base case projection here at ICF. We update our base case on a quarterly basis. So this is a more recent projection than the API cases, which were provided earlier this year. We generally see that the Marcellus Utica production levels will rise to upwards of 40 billion cubic feet per day by 2025. Pretty phenomenal growth out of the basin. The basin currently sits at about 22 billion cubic feet per day, as I alluded to earlier. That's off of a level back in 2010 that was only around 2 billion cubic feet per day. And this type of production growth can be accomplished with relatively modest changes in well activity. You can see that the projected well completions going forward are generally in the 3,000 well per year ballpark, which is not inconsistent with the levels of activity that we were seeing back in 2014 and 15. We've experienced a near-term lull in activity. Certainly drilling has been off over the past year and a half. That's because of the relatively low commodity prices, particularly the collapse in oil price that occurred in late 2015. We don't necessarily see that lull in activity as being a longer-term trend in markets. We generally see that oil prices will gradually rise over time, consistent with the futures market, and gas prices will also be up in the future, consistent with the futures market. And thus, the rebound in prices and the market growth that's occurring in our projection will generally drive a rebound in E&P activity and drive the production growth that you're seeing here. Next slide, please. If I peel the onion even a little bit more and look more specifically at Ohio's oil and gas production growth, we see that the gas and oil production generally doubles between today's level out through 2025. Currently, gas production from the Utica and the overlapping Marcellus that's in Ohio, or overlying Marcellus that's in Ohio, is generally around 4 billion cubic feet per day. We see the gas production rising up to about 9 billion cubic feet per day by 2025. And the oil and liquids production, this is NGLs as well as oil production that I'm showing that's tied to the axis, the y-axis on the right, is generally between 200,000 and 250,000 barrels per day at present, and that rises to about 500,000 barrels per day by 2035. Again, this type of production growth would not necessarily be fostered or motivated without the market growth and without the infrastructure development that we project for API. And that infrastructure development is tied to regulatory approvals that will be necessary to foster the type of infrastructure development going forward. Next slide, please. So what did we find for API regarding infrastructure development to support this type of supply growth and market development going forward? Well, we first projected that the robust development for oil and gas from shale plays will continue to promote rapid infrastructure development over a prolonged period of time. That, everyone generally asked the question as we were doing the API study, would the type of infrastructure development that we've been experiencing over the past 5 to 10 years continue? And the answer to that question is definitely yes. Capital expenditures were projected in the $56 to $71 billion per year ballpark across the U.S. That totals $1 to $1.4, that should read trillion dollars, not billion dollars, trillion dollars from 2017 to 2035. Investment in infrastructure will continue to contribute significantly to the U.S. gross domestic product to the tune of $79 to $100 billion annually. That's because there is a multiplier effect on the investment. And finally, infrastructure development will employ an average of over 800,000 to upwards of 1 million individuals in the U.S. per year. And this doesn't even count employees that would be associated with operating and maintaining the infrastructure, which could be far greater, and individuals employed in the distribution parts of the business. This is strictly infrastructure development, employees that are developing infrastructure related to oil and gas production and oil and gas delivery. Regulatory approvals for the midstream projects is imperative, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. I'll cover this one quickly in the essence of time. I think what this slide generally shows is that pipeline development will be very significant and that we're getting significant amounts of new transport capability that will be needed to move the molecules around the continent from the supply areas where the molecules are being produced to market areas where the molecules are being consumed. Next slide, please. So if I peel the onion and look at $1 trillion to $1.4 billion of investment in infrastructure that occurs between 2017 and 2035, we find that roughly 20% of that projected infrastructure development is concentrated in the Northeast. And the vast majority of that development in the Northeast is associated with build out and connection of the Marcellus and Utica molecules to markets elsewhere. And so the Northeast is a very significant driver of the infrastructure development going forward. And again, it is imperative that regulatory approvals are put in place or happen to promote or foster the infrastructure development over time. Next slide, please. If I peel the onion a little bit more and look at the breakdown of the oil and gas infrastructure associated with the development of the Marcellus and Utica play, we find that of the $11 to $14 billion, upwards of $14 billion per year of investment that are occurring in the Northeast, between $9 and $13 billion per year are associated with building out gathering and processing facilities and pipelines, essentially 86% of the total investment. And that's the red and the blue, light blue wedges on these charts. That's the vast majority of the investment going forward. Then you have other things like fractionation facilities and oil and gas storage, oil and gas handling capabilities, and export facilities that will contribute to the totals. Certainly the regulatory approvals are important to make this happen. And there are a number of major pipeline projects that are already underway or in various stages in the Northeast. And those include Rover, Nexus, Atlantic Sunrise, Atlantic Coast Pipeline, Mountain Valley, Constitution, and Penn East. Some of these projects are having difficulties getting approvals. They're certainly being opposed in various regulatory forums, so they may not necessarily happen, which would place this type of infrastructure development or level of investment in infrastructure at risk going forward. Next slide, please. If I peel the onion and look at Ohio's development a little bit more specifically and in greater detail, we find that in the API study, Ohio actually ranked 5th among the U.S. states with oil and gas infrastructure development, accounting for 36,000 to 48,000 jobs and adding $1.5 to $2 billion annually to the gross state product within the state of Ohio. There were various forms of infrastructure development. There were over 500, or there were roughly 500 to 750 oil, gas, and gas wells completed per year, and those would require a lot of surface facilities to foster the production. There were 2,000 to 3,000 miles of gathering lines built between 2017 and 2035 within Ohio. There's 6 to 7 billion cubic feet per day of new gas processing capability put in place over the time frame, 200 to 250,000 barrels per day of fractionation capacity, and between 2,500 and 3,500 miles of pipeline built. Rover, of course, is one of the pipeline projects that's already under construction. Nexus has received its federal approvals, and there could be other projects that are currently unforeseen that would be developed over time. So the bottom line of this slide is that the midstream infrastructure development to support the oil and gas production in Ohio could be very significant. One last thing I would like to add is that some of the pipeline development could be targeted to or delivery capability could be targeted to new petrochem facilities, which could reside in Ohio and elsewhere. And I think more will be talked about on that particular subject with the other panelists. Next slide, please. So what could go wrong? Well, there could be environmental catastrophes associated with oil and gas activity. There could be greater opposition to hydrocarbon development and infrastructure needed for delivery of oil and gas. Certainly we're seeing that pipeline projects, for instance, are being opposed in various regulatory forums across the Northeast. There could be continued delays and or denials of the permits. We've seen New York State, for instance, denying water permits. New Jersey recently followed suit on that with the Penn East pipeline project. So stay tuned. There could be a lot of delays and denials of permits for pipelines in particular. There could be a lack of market development. Maybe the global markets don't grow as robustly as we project. Maybe global LNG consumption is not as robust as we project. So the exports of molecules out of the U.S. to markets around the globe that would need the molecules is a pretty important driver of the infrastructure development and supply development here in the States. There could be prolonged reduction of oil and gas prices. That would be manifested in the form of global market development, perhaps being lower than we otherwise project over time. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I do have some key takeaways. Those are that the robust growth of oil and gas supply is likely to continue, particularly from the Marcellus and Utica. The market growth and regulatory approvals are imperative for supply growth and infrastructure development. Ohio generally fares pretty well and its economy benefits from the infrastructure development. It ranks 5th in the API study among US states with job creation and gross state product contribution. And then finally, much of the new infrastructure is required to meet the market growth going forward. So with that, I'll conclude and turn it over to Dr. Carney.
All right, thank you very much, Kevin. Lots of great insight there. So our next speaker is going to be Chris Ziegler again from Executive Director at API Ohio. Before we turn it over to Chris, I just want to remind our attendees, if they'd like to ask a question of the panelists, at the end, please type in your question in the question pane of the GoToWebinar interface. And please let us know who you'd like us to direct the question to. And so submit those at any time during the presentation, and we'll do the Q&A following all of our speakers. So we'll hand it over to Chris. Take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Carney. Here we go. My name is Chris Ziegler. I'm the Executive Director of API Ohio. I thought I would start with just a brief overview of what is API, do a snapshot of the Appalachia region compared to other shale regions, developing shale regions across the country. There's going to be a lot of overlap with regard to the information that Kevin shared and some of the information that I have. I'll give an overview of current development in Ohio, and then talk about some potential for use of our shale resources in not only in the region, in the Appalachian region, but in Ohio. So next slide, please. So going back, so API is a division of the American Petroleum Institute. We represent, we're a national trade association representing all segments of America's oil and natural gas industry. We have more than 625 members that produce, process, and distribute most of our nation's energy. API actually got our start. We got our start during World War I when Congress came to the oil and natural gas industry looking for help in order to fuel the war effort for World War I. And what they found during that time is that production, infrastructure, distribution in one area may not match up with another producing field. So as a result, in 1919, API started as a trade association with an emphasis on standards development. So we write the standards. We're the world's leading developer of standards for the oil and natural gas industry. So we write the standards for pipeline operation, safety, and other elements with regard to our industry. As I said, there's going to be some overlap with regard to the information that Kevin shared and what I have. This chart that you're looking at right now is from EIA, the U.S.'s Energy Information Administration Drilling Productivity Report. This is a report that they put out monthly, and it tracks shale development in different areas of the country. Or I should say recently, Appalachia was actually split up between Utica and Marcellus. They recently combined the information into one production report for that area. But one note is that, and significant note, is that of the 7 shale regions across the country, Appalachia currently accounts for nearly 42% of natural gas production. So right now, Appalachia combined, that's Utica and Marcellus, is about 24.6 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas production. The next largest producing region, natural gas production region in the country is the Permian at 8.6 billion cubic feet a day. So you can see there's sort of wide difference between what we're producing in Appalachia and other parts of the country. Now, with regard to oil production, as Kevin mentioned, Appalachia is a natural gas play versus an oil play. So Appalachia ranks 6th out of 7 shale regions for oil production with 98,000 barrels per day compared to 2.6 million barrels a day of oil production in the Permian. Next slide, please. So this is also taken from the Drilling Productivity Report. This is information regarding per rig development in Appalachia. What this generally says or shows you is as our technology has improved, natural gas production continues to increase while rig counts have dropped. Now, there has been a slight uptick in rigs and a slight downturn in terms of natural gas in new well gas production per rig. But so the chart on the left represents the number of rigs, the black line in relation to the amount of natural gas production in the blue line. And as you can see, gas production has increased significantly since 2015, while the number of rigs has decreased. Better technology decreases service impact from rigs while enabling more production below the surface. The chart on the right shows a tremendous growth in production in the Appalachian region, especially over the last several years. Next slide, please. So with regard to activity here in Ohio, in our state, I grabbed this information from the Department of Natural Resources as of September 9th. Actually, there was some more updated information that came out yesterday, so for the week of September 16. Current rig count, we've actually dropped one. We're at 23 rigs operating. Those are Utica rigs operating in Ohio. There were 15 additional permits issued, and generally the total permits, total wells drilled, and total wells producing are generally the same. The map on the right-hand side of the chart shows permitted wells, drilled wells, and producing wells. What we have found is that the sweet spot, as we call it, has shrunk in Ohio. So there was activity in Tuscarawas County and other parts of the state, and those have shrunk down to less than a handful of counties that are really the high production counties for the state. There were actually member companies of API that were in early. They were generally looking for oil to produce in the state. What they found is they know the oil was down there, but it wasn't economical to produce. So one particular company, I think, walked away from a $500 billion investment. So $500 million investment, I'm sorry. So fairly significant, but again, the sweet spot has shrunk with regard to producing wells in Ohio. Next slide, please. I put together this chart. This just tracks the Utica permits issued since 2011 versus the Utica rig count. it's fairly significant in terms of how it increased and decreased significantly with a drop in commodity prices. What it shows, there is a 44% drop in drilling permits in 2016 compared to 2015, and a 99% change compared to 2014. In 2016, there were 561 permits issued. 2015, there were 997 permits issued, and in 2014, 1,659 permits issued. So reduced drilling activity, as Kevin mentioned, is a result of a number of different things, but it's generally followed commodity prices, especially oil prices. So companies have focused on completing wells to make way for production when prices increase. Now, recently, the number of permits and rigs has slightly increased over the last couple of quarters. Next slide, please. So this is also a chart I put together. This is an Ohio annual shale production chart for both oil and natural gas in the state. Oil is in the red, natural gas is in the green. Generally, oil production in Ohio refers to condensate, and it certainly hasn't been as positive as dry natural gas production. In 2011, there were 43,000 barrels of oil or condensate produced compared to 18 million barrels of oil in 2016. However, oil production has fallen over 5 million barrels from 2015 to 2016, or 22% decrease. Now, the tremendous bright spot for us here in Ohio has been Utica natural gas production. In 2011, there were 2.5 million MCF, million cubic feet of natural gas produced, compared to 1.4 trillion cubic feet in 2016, a 533% increase of natural gas produced. So in 2016, 1.4 trillion cubic feet annual production was more than enough to supply Ohio's total natural gas consumption for 2015 numbers, which was 939 cubic feet. And that split out to 285 billion cubic feet for residential use, 166 billion cubic feet for commercial use, 276 billion cubic feet for industrial, and 210 billion cubic feet for electric power use. In 27, the first two quarters combined, we are looking at production of 759 billion cubic feet of natural gas and 7.9 million barrels of oil. Again, we are producing enough here in our state, more than enough for our state's total natural gas consumption, which is fantastic. Next slide, please. So in terms of economics, what does that do for our state? This chart is from the Ohio Department of Jobs and Family Services. They put out a quarterly shale report. Their latest report is from the fourth quarter of 2016. And what this shows is in core shale related industries, the average salary was nearly $74,000, or $26,000 more than all other industries with regard to their average salary. In ancillary shale related industries, it was nearly $65,000, or $17,000 more than all other industries in Ohio. API also had a recent report that highlighted numbers from 2015. In 2015, we showed that there were nearly 190,000 jobs in Ohio related to natural gas, or 3.6% of the total jobs in the state. The top three sectors with the greatest number of jobs were chemical manufacturing, which Jen Klein will talk about, natural gas distribution, and oil and gas pipeline construction. And the contribution to Ohio's economy in terms of direct, indirect, and induced value added in 2015 was $26.7 billion, of which $16 billion was related to end-use segment, $7 billion was from infrastructure segment, and $3 billion was from the production segment. Next slide, please. So, and Kevin touched on these points as well in terms of where do we go with the gas that we're producing? Well, we need to get it to other markets in order to provide value, to provide incentive for further development production of our natural gas resources here in the region. This is information that we took from RBN Energy. API doesn't do its own market projections or forecasting, but this certainly seemed to be an interesting slide that RBN put together, and I think may be helpful with regard to our discussion today. What this shows is they ran 3 scenarios. They had an advanced scenario with regard to Henry Hub prices for natural gas, a growth scenario, sort of a midline scenario with regard to production and takeaway capacity, and a cutback scenario, sort of a low-end scenario in terms of production growth and takeaway capacity. What this shows essentially, so the production growth in the black line, this is for Northeast natural gas, so essentially Northeast natural gas being Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, so the Appalachian region. It shows that the colored bars are essentially destinations. So this is where marketed natural gas would go, either through or at endpoints in the Midwest, to the Gulf via Ohio, east, for different purposes, LNG, South Atlantic, up to Canada in production. The bottom line from this chart is that capacity is exceeding production, which is a good thing, because we need to have a market for our natural gas. Without a market, then there will be no incentive to continue production of our resource here in the state. Under the advanced scenario, 2022 Henry Hub gas prices were estimated to be $3.90 per MMBTU. And under their scenario, RBN scenario, Marcellus and Utica production rockets to 33.2 billion cubic feet a day, up 47% from today. While under their growth scenario, which is what we're looking at right now, they projected $3.60 per MMBTU of natural gas in 2022, with production jumping to 31.3 billion cubic feet a day, a 38% gain. And their cutback scenario at $3.25 per MMBTU of natural gas prices 5 years from now, production rises 30% to 29.4 billion cubic feet a day. So again, bottom line, projected capacity is exceeding production, which is exactly what we need here in order to make sure that our resources continue to be developed. Next slide, please. So natural gas takeaway capacity, significant growth in takeaway capacity over the last several years, over the last few years. Outflow capacity from the Marcellus and Utica formations has increased by about 2.5 billion cubic feet a day this year, with approximately another 2.5 billion cubic feet a day by next year. About 20 projects are due to come online by 2020, so these are pipeline projects and other infrastructure investments in the Northeast area. So this, again, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, barring any delays or cancellations. Again, another point that Kevin had mentioned in terms of regulatory impacts with some of these projects. But takeaway capacity will soon exceed current production levels, which will provide capacity for production increases and reduce discount between Marcellus Hub pricing and that of Henry Hub and others. So as we see more build out of infrastructure, more pipeline to other markets, this is stabilizing prices that producers were getting in the Appalachian Basin versus the national benchmark, the Henry Hub. So the last I checked today, Henry Hub was trading at $3.18 per MMBTU. Dominion South, which is a hub here in the Appalachian region, natural gas is $1.75 per MMBTU. So with the more build out of capacity to other markets, we will hopefully see that price stabilize sooner than later. So that producers will have, again, more incentive to produce and getting these resources to other markets. A year ago, exit capacity from Ohio, so takeaway capacity from producing in the state to other markets outside the state, was about 5.0 or 5 billion cubic feet a day. By the end of 2018, assuming no delays or cancellations of projects, capacity will exceed 10 billion cubic feet a day. Next slide, please. So what are some of the current projects? As Kevin mentioned, the two big projects are the Rover, which is an Energy Transfer Partners project, and the Nexus project, which is a Spectra Enbridge project. Rover Phase 1, Part A came online September 1st, approaching 700 million MCF a day, which was immediately at capacity. So as soon as that section came online, it was immediately at capacity. with the remainder of phase 1 later this year and phase 2 coming online in 2018. Ultimately, the project's max capacity is 3.25 billion cubic feet a day. Nexus, or the Spectra Enbridge project, recently received FERC approval with a target date of 2018 of in-service time at 1.5 billion cubic feet a day. The remainder of Rover Phase 1 is on track for to be in service by November of 2017, and Phase 2 in service by December of 2017 or early next year. Both Rover and Nexus will eventually connect to the Vector pipeline network in Michigan, and Vector carries gas into Canada. The Leach Express and the Southwest Lebanon expansion are smaller projects, but the significance of these projects is that they will add additional compression to the network so that we can get resources down to the Gulf or southern parts of the country. So that's the significance of those two projects. Other pipeline projects that have come online recently include a Marathon Petroleum project, a Cornerstone pipeline, which it's a 50-mile line that runs from Cadiz in Harrison County up to Marathon Petroleum's refinery in Canton, Ohio. Again, 50-mile pipeline came online October of last year, and it delivers condensate, natural gasoline, and butane to the refinery so that they can use that in the process of their operations in the refinery. Just a little snapshot in terms of what we have here in the state already with regard to pipeline infrastructure. In 2015, Ohio had nearly 25,000 miles of gas gathering lines and six gas processing plants in the state with a capacity of 2,100 million MCF a day. In addition, there were 9,700 miles of gas pipelines and 552 miles of crude oil pipelines, 1,200 miles of NGL pipelines, and 2,600 miles of product pipelines. We don't have any CO2 pipelines in the state. Next slide, please. So other than moving natural gas to other markets, stabilizing prices, what are some of the other uses, or where can we take these products? And one of the uses, the expected uses, is regional use with regard to ethane cracker plants. Jennifer will touch on this more than I am, but this is just a snapshot of some of the projects that we're looking at currently. So an ethane cracker plant uses ethane as a component of natural gas to produce the building blocks for the plastics industry. So two projects. One is the PTT, Global Chemical America project that they're in Belmont County. Recently they announced they purchased 168 acres from First Energy. They're expecting a final decision by the end of this year with thousands of construction jobs and hundreds of permanent jobs. The other ethane cracker plant in this region is Shale's Chemical Appalachia plant up in Monaca, Pennsylvania. It's near Pittsburgh, with expected 6,000 construction jobs and 600 permanent employees. Why that's important to us here in Ohio is that they're taking product, as you can see from the map on the bottom right, via their Falcon ethane pipeline project from Cadiz up to Scio over to their cracker plant in Monaca. So that means more jobs, that means additional outlet for natural gas resources here in the state. Next slide, please. So with regard to in-state use, one of the great potentials that we have is for use of natural gas in our power generation. And one note that I said here is Ohio has started to take advantage of its affordable natural gas and power generation, but continues to grow this opportunity. More natural gas combined cycle plants need to come online in order for us to take advantage of this. Natural gas fired power generation has grown substantially since 2008. The blue line represents the amount of natural gas used for power generation in Ohio each year for the last 20 years. As you can see, substantial growth that has occurred since 2008. However, as production levels continue to increase, in order for Ohio to continue to utilize our own natural gas resource and power generation, new natural gas combined cycle plants need to come online to make increased natural gas use a reality. Next slide, please. So why is this important, especially to producers here in the state? Power generation provides demand outlet and drives production-related benefits. Actually, from a 2012 ICF study, we found this information that a 1,000 megawatt natural gas combined cycle plant uses about 0.2 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas. So for every 5,000 megawatts of natural gas combined cycle capacity added, natural gas demand increases by about 1 BCF a day. 1 BCF a day drives new demand and drives 1 BCF a day of new production. And according to the ICF study back in 2012, for every additional BCF a day of natural gas produced, approximately 13,000 upstream and midstream direct and indirect jobs are created. Right now, the Utica, and Kevin pointed this out, the Utica region currently produces about 4 billion cubic feet a day. So for every 5,000 megawatts of natural gas power plant capacity added, natural gas demand increases by about 1 billion cubic feet a day. And there are over 9,800 megawatts of new natural gas power plants scheduled or planned to come online between 2017 and the end of 2021. That will increase demand for natural gas by almost 2 billion cubic feet a day, accounting for close to half of the current Utica production. Next slide, please. This is a map of new power plant, new natural gas combined cycle power plant investments in Ohio. What this shows is that there are over 9,800 megawatts of natural gas power generation expected to come online. Recently, see in the top left, the Oregon Clean Energy Center came online, starting to provide power. They are Clean Energy Future, the company behind that investment, is looking to set up another plant and with plants across the state, hopefully coming online soon. Again, this would be an outlet for demand growth and incentivizing more production of our natural gas resources in the state, leading to an estimate of more than 14,000 direct jobs created and $10 billion for the state. Now, Kevin pointed out that there could be regulatory considerations that could impact decisions or pipeline or infrastructure development. With regard to new power plant investments, there are currently policy issues that we're debating here at the State House that could also have an impact of how much is invested in the state. So we will wait and see if in fact we do, if we will in fact be able to take advantage of our natural gas resources for power generation. Next slide, please. So one of the, per the debate that's happening here at the State House, there's discussion about natural gas power generation and reliability. From a reliability standpoint, natural gas power plants receive fuel from multiple pipeline sources, making them very reliable. Even if one pipeline would become disabled, other pipelines can meet the demand and keep the plant up and running. And many plants are capable of running on more than one type of fuel, giving them extra reliability. And as you can see, there's a network of power generation facilities that are connected to diversified pipeline systems and other facilities across our Northeast region of the country. Next slide, please. So what benefits would we see here in Ohio as we move to more power generation, natural gas power generation in the state? Well, abundant natural gas has been driving natural gas prices, which in turn has driven down electricity prices. So since 2008, average annual wholesale prices in Ohio have decreased almost 50%. This chart represents the average annual wholesale price of the three major natural gas hubs and the direct relationship those prices play in lowering the cost of electricity. As the price of natural gas drops, dollars per MMBTU on the right side, so does the price of megawatts of power, or dollars per megawatt hour, on the left side. So as you can see, more natural gas production, having more outlets here in the state through natural gas power generation benefits Ohio consumers. Other benefits include, next slide please, a decrease in CO2 emissions. So as more natural gas power plants come online, CO2 emissions have dropped in Ohio. The green line in the top chart represents new natural gas generation, which has been increasing. The blue line represents coal generation, which has been decreasing. And the purple line represents CO2 emissions, which has steadily decreased as more gas-fired generation has come online. As more gas-fired generation comes online and coal plants retire, emissions continue to decrease while reducing costs for consumers. The second chart represents changes in Ohio's power generation fuel sources in recent years. You can see that as more coal plants in the blue retire, natural gas plants in the green have been growing to replace it. Next slide, please. So again, in terms of our in-state use of our shale resources, markets are working for Ohio consumers and businesses. And again, more in-state use through power generation not only encourages further development of our shale resources, but benefits consumers as well. When the playing field is level, all players in the state have the same ability to bid and supply generation and serve the utility load. Competition is driving efficiency. Older, less efficient resources are being replaced with more efficient, less costly plants, and relatively low cost of natural gas and Ohio's resource advantage has been driving in-state investment. Independent power producers building new generation and bearing the risk are doing this not on the backs of ratepayers, but making their own investment. And Ohio is reducing its power plant emissions. That's the conclusion of my report.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Chris. And without further ado, we'll move on to Jennifer. And as a final reminder, please get your questions, audience members, into the question panel of the GoToWebinar control system. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be on this webinar and to the information that we've seen that Chris and others have given. This is great and leads into kind of these upstream opportunities that you are seeing. Next slide, please. Want to just give a brief overview of who and what the Ohio Chemistry Technology Council is. Similar to API Ohio, we are the same. We are the trade organization representing chemical manufacturers in Ohio. Next slide, please. When you look at, we talk about American chemistry as the cornerstone of our economy. You basically, from the chemical industry, you get the actual production of chemicals that are then converted into other intermediaries and other products for other industries that then go into a product that then are what you ultimately see on the end shelf. We kind of joke that you don't hear too much about the chemical industry in Ohio because we're not that end product on the shelf, but we're in every end product, including who are part of the shelf. Next slide, please. So the chemical industry is comprised of thousands of companies throughout the world. And basically what we do is we use and convert basic raw materials, such as you have heard, oil, natural gas, air, water, metals, minerals, and we produce more than 70,000 different products or chemicals that have commercial value to consumers in other industries. This is some of the industry sectors. This is not remotely all-inclusive, but some of the industry sectors that rely on the chemical industry to produce and manufacture their products. So our chemicals are used to produce plastics, synthetic fibers, lightweight automobile parts, fertilizers, cosmetics, household materials, computers, and just a limitless amount of other products. In fact, 96% of all manufactured goods are touched by the business of chemistry. For example, I mean, I like to talk about that the chemical industry is a societal problem solver. The industry, if there's a problem, we are the solution. We've synthesized crop-enhancing agricultural chemicals to ensure constant and viable food supplies, helped in the eradication of deadly diseases with life-saving pharmaceuticals and chemical pesticides. We've developed innovative plastics and synthetics fibers used all over the world. To give you kind of a few examples, the agricultural industry, which is big here in Ohio, makes use of many different types of chemicals. Fertilizers, insecticides, fungicides, pesticides are all used to protect crops. Many of the chemical companies have also developed a product that make crops that are drought tolerant or pesticide resistant, and have properties that reduce environmental impacts by allowing no-till farming and other green practices. These products help sustain higher yields, reduce the loss of crops, and decrease the level of toxins produced by bacteria and fungi. So that's just one example. You look at the health and hygiene industry, and chemical sciences give us an understanding on the development of various diseases. Like cancer, for example, they help improve care and protection with diagnostics and sensors for prevention and diagnostics of deadly diseases. We've got a lot of challenges that we're going to see as our population continues to grow, and the chemical industry is going to be a huge part of improving health protection and care. I'll talk a little bit more about some of these other industry sectors, specifically maybe automotive, as well as sustainable energy solutions here in a bit. Next slide. What you heard a lot from the other presenters is, and I talked about these raw materials that we use, and I'm going to use natural gas for this example. And you've heard talk of the cracker, but you take, this is about as basic as you can get, and taking the natural gas, pulling out the ethane, getting it to a cracker that makes all these intermediate products that then go into all the different products that you use every day. We're not in a room together, so I can't see if any hands are raised, but I asked the question, raise your hand if you don't own any sort of electronic device, a phone, a computer, a TV, anything like that. You usually don't get any hands raised. Raise your hand if you've never taken an aspirin or any sort of medicine, or been to the hospital, or had a loved one who's been to the hospital. Usually don't get a lot of hands raised. Raise your hand if you're not wearing any clothes. That's usually the point where I pray that no one puts up their hand, and I'm hoping, I can't see folks, that continues to be the case. But basically everything you touch, wear, use, see every day is brought to you courtesy of the chemical manufacturing industry. Next slide, please. So I want to get into the business of chemistry by the numbers. I kind of talk, the heading of my slide is the chemical industry, the science behind Ohio's economic success, and I want to show you why that's a fact, and why what's going on with the Utica and Marcellus Shale and just around the U.S. is so beneficial to our industry. Next slide, please. So the chemical industry, I'm going to kind of start nationally, is a major component of the U.S. economy. It's an over $800 billion industry that supports almost 25% of the U.S. GDP, or the equivalent of $4 trillion. This is more than the entire GDP of leading world economies as Germany, France, and the UK. The U.S. chemical industry produces 15% of the world's chemical output. The industry directly employs over 800,000 people nationwide. For every chemical industry job created, an additional 6.3 jobs are produced elsewhere in the economy, representing a total of another 6 million U.S. jobs. And next slide, please. So that's the national picture. I want to talk about Ohio, which is who we represent. And it's so exciting to get to talk about the industry in Ohio, because folks don't realize what a huge impact we have here. The chemical manufacturing, we are the 6th largest chemical manufacturing state in the U.S. and the 2nd largest manufacturing industry in Ohio. We directly employ over 43,000 people. We have an average wage of over $80,000. That's almost 40% higher than the average manufacturing wage. We generate over $3.5 billion in payroll. Annually, we invest $1 billion in capital infrastructure projects, and we export over $6.5 billion in products. And while we're on this slide, I want to talk a little bit, as we've talked natural gas imports and exports, I wanted to just talk a little bit Ohio's imports, exports. The total two-way trade between Ohio and other trading partners in the world, my most recent numbers are a couple years old, but 2015. But our total trade between Ohio and other world partners was $16 billion in 2015. In terms of exports, Ohio, as I indicated, exports 6.5 billion annually. And compared to other U.S. states, that puts Ohio 11th in terms of the most chemicals exported to the world. For imports, Ohio imported 9.5 billion in chemicals from around the world in 2015. And compared to other U.S. states, that puts Ohio 10th in the terms of most chemicals imported in the world. So we are a very robust state in terms of the chemical imports and exports. Next slide, please. I want to get into the new investment in chemical plastics capacity that you're seeing, and a large and most of that is due to what we're seeing from the shale plays here within the region. Next slide. So back about 7 years ago, the American Chemistry Council started tracking, we started seeing these small ethane projects occur, and ACC started tracking what sort of shale induced projects are we seeing based on this oil and gas drilling. And as of late November of last year, and these numbers have actually increased, we're tracking 281 projects valued at close to $168 billion. What's really interesting to note is 61% of these projects are foreign-based dollars or include a foreign partner. So what's really interesting to see is, for the chemical industry, natural gas is not just to turn on our lights, but as I indicated, it is our raw material to manufacture our projects. So you're seeing higher based feedstock prices in other parts of the world and lower here in the US. And so you're seeing a lot of movement and foreign investment into the US. Additionally, we're tracking more than 600 plastic processor projects here in the US, and I will get into what that means for Ohio here in a minute. Next slide, please. This next slide, I think, ties into what you saw from the other presenters as we look at chemical industry investment in correlation to shale gas development, starting back in December of 2010 to December of last year. So as you see the growth in drilling from shale gas, you see a correlation of chemical industry projects related to that. So there is a very direct correlation between the two industry sectors. Next slide, please. So in Ohio, all that investment that I've referenced, 6.9 billion, almost 7 billion of that is from Ohio. So we are 9th in the chemical industry projects due to shale gas projects. When we see, when we see the Shell cracker come online and then the announcement with the PTT cracker, you're going to see that growth happen significantly. Right now, with the industry, you see a lot of expansions, which is wonderful. We've got a robust industry in the state, and you're continuing to see that industry grow and thrive. But with the introduction of the crackers, you will see new facilities being built. So we will only grow from what we currently have. Next slide, please. So looking at that $7 billion in proposed projects, I wanted to break down the jobs So you can kind of see, what is that $7 billion in proposed projects? What do those jobs actually look like? What are the direct, indirect, and induced effect? And this helps us too as we're looking at our workforce development and our education system. Where do we need to be focusing? Because a lot of folks think, oh, these are just chemical engineer jobs. These are 4-year degrees. And what you're really seeing, I mean, look at production workers, maintenance and logistics. Those are actually the majority of the jobs that you're going to see. These are vocational education job or programs that lead to, we call them jobs, but they lead to careers. We just had a company, one of our major companies, in with us today, PPG, and the gentleman has worked there almost 30 years with no end in sight. These are careers. You build up through them, but you come out and you're making easily within a couple of years, you know, 60, 70,000 jobs, or $70,000. So we think it's really important that we're stressing, you know, these 4-year degrees, but also these instrument techs, welders, maintenance, and, you know, technician jobs. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk about those plastic processor projects. As I indicated, we're tracking approximately 600. As you can see, a majority of them are expansions, but there is still maybe a little less than a third that's new construction. Actually, Ohio is currently the #1 plastics producing state in the US. I encourage you to go to YouTube and check out Jobs Ohio has a fantastic video. If you type in Jobs Ohio and plastics, a great video that highlights Ohio's leading in the polymer plastics industry. Next slide. So where does Ohio fall in those 600 plastics processor projects? And I encourage everyone trying to say that 3 times fast. Ohio is actually 3rd in the nation in those announced projects. And actually, that has, the slide is out of date since I sent it. I believe the American Chemistry Council Economics Department has done a revision where we are actually 2nd in the US. So regardless, it just shows that Ohio is just a huge player in this shale play and in the chemical industry. And we're only seeing growth into these different kind of the polymers sector and so many opportunities. So I wanted to highlight a little bit of, as I talk about plastics, why is it so important? Next slide, please. And what you see, so I wanted to give you an example of, you know, a building. You're building a home, and the amount of plastics that are used in that process for energy use reductions, carbon reductions, waste reductions, material use. So much of a home is now plastic and polymer based, and those are all energy efficient opportunities. And so it's great that Ohio is leading that charge. The automotive industry is big in Ohio. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give an example of what you see of plastics and automotive, and I think the most interesting stat is that the plastics, today's plastics make up about 50% of the volume of the new lightweight vehicles, but actually only are less than 10% of the actual weight of the car. So you've got 50% of the car being plastic, but only being 10% of the actual weight of the vehicle. So as we've got these new standards that come down the pipeline, no pun intended, you're seeing, you know, the chemical industry, the plastics industry, the polymer industry being that problem solver. Next slide, please. Finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about was this Appalachian Regional Petrochemical and Plastics Hub. Ohio is working with Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and West Virginia. There is a real opportunity for this region to stand out as a petrochemical and plastics manufacturing hub. A recent study was done by the American Chemistry Council, and you can see we're looking at potentially $36 billion in capital investment, over 100,000 jobs created and supported, $28 billion in economic expansion, $2.9 billion in tax revenue annually. But there are some things that we need to do in order to see that come to fruition. And so us 4 states, my counterparts in those other states in the chemical industries, as well as working with our congressional and state delegations to see this come to fruition. There is a regional hub down in Texas and Louisiana, and that's one reason why you see it is kind of the top chemical area in the U.S. And all we're looking to do is pick up what they've done and kind of plop it down here in this region. No need to reinvent the wheel and make Ohio and this region a hub. Next slide, please. So with that, I kind of end. I just wanted to identify who our members are, because I think a lot of folks, you see some names you recognize: Dow, DuPont, BASF, PPG, but companies that you may have never heard of: Tremco, McGeehan, energy. Well, we talked a lot about Energy Transfer Partners, Emery, and one thing we talked about when we talked about the PTT Global Cracker, one thing that folks need to realize is PTT actually already has a footprint in Ohio. Emery Oleochemicals, which is a company based out, or is down in Cincinnati, is actually half owned by PTT Global. So they have a current presence here in Ohio. But Georgia Pacific, I guess if you're in any airport and you use the facilities there and you go to the toilet paper holder, it is going to say Georgia Pacific on that toilet paper holder. That plastic on there is Georgia Pacific, right here out of Columbus, Ohio. So just wanted to give you an idea of some of those companies that you may not be as familiar with. Next slide, please. And with that, those are my comments, and always happy to answer any questions.
All right, great, Jennifer. Thank you very much, and thank you very much again to all of our presenters. So we're going to move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. We have about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how many questions there are. Again, if there are any attendees that have any specific questions they want to ask, please go to the question pane of the GoToWebinar interface and type in your question, and please let me know who you would like me to direct it to. So I'm gonna I'm gonna kick off the Q&A and then see if we'll move on from that. So here we go. Okay, so the first question I would like to address to Kevin. And any other speakers after that who would like to address it as well. So this is about liquefied natural gas exports and exports to someone in general. So the federal government has been removing restrictions on liquefied natural gas, or LNG, exports, and the potential for such exports is a major energy policy talking point for the current administration. What potential impacts do you see of substantially increased LNG exports for the region and midstream development here in the Ohio River Valley? So Kevin, if you should still be here, so if you could address that for us, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Carney. Yeah, that's a question that I think I touched on pretty specifically in my presentation. With the development of markets across the continent and elsewhere around the globe, those markets are extremely important for Ohio's and the Northeast development going forward. As I mentioned in the API cases, the LNG exports rise to upwards of 10 billion cubic feet per day in the base case and about 20 billion cubic feet per day in the high case. That's a big driver because Ohio obviously is long on natural gas. It produces more natural gas than it can consume in the future, with our projection rising to about 9 billion cubic feet per day of gas production out of the Ohio Valley. That production, of course, supplies the local demand, and that local demand, as pointed out, is in the form of petrochemical gas use and as well as power plants, incremental power plants. But even then, the local demand is not great enough to absorb that level of production in the future. So the LNG export development is very important for Ohio's market. Without it, you wouldn't necessarily see the outlet for gas, Ohio gas, that would be transported elsewhere.
All right, great. I just wanted to bring that up since it has been a major talking point recently in the discussion. So this next one, I'm going to move on to Chris. Take a question here. So this is actually from your presentation, Chris. You mentioned that the sweet spot for drilling in Ohio has shrunk in the recent past. I was wondering if you could discuss that the transition to a smaller production area, as I understand it from your presentation?
Well, I think that's, thank you, Doctor. I think that's a result of the economics. I think that in terms of developing dry natural gas, the area has, in terms of exploration development, has shrunk as a result of that. There may be cases, as I pointed out, one API member was in here in the state looking to develop oil resources. And although the oil resources are here, they knew they were here, it just wasn't economical for them in order to develop and produce those. So as a result of the economics, the sweet spot has shrunk. Hopefully, as demand growth increases, there are more outlets. We can move our product to other markets and take advantage, LNG exports or whatever it may be. We could potentially see that development region expand to address those needs. But right now, I would suggest that the reason for that is because of the economics that we have today.
Great. So I'm going to move on to Jennifer. So I have a question for you about using natural gas or other hydrocarbon inputs in the chemistry industry, and how, in particular, if you could comment on the current low regional price for those resources has impacted the chemistry industry. So my understanding, and just again listening, is that the regional price is currently low relative to the national price because of the long position here in Ohio. And so how have the chemistry manufacturers, for lack of a better term, have been taking advantage of that kind of price differential?
Great question, and I think you're seeing that in those 280 projects that are being tracked nationally. That $7 billion of that has either already expanded in Ohio, is in the process of expanding, or has announced an expansion. We in the U.S. use natural gas as our primary feedstock, and as the other presenters had great slides. It showed the price of natural gas decreasing significantly over the years, so thereby decreasing our feedstock prices, where overseas they use an oil-based feedstocks called naphtha, and those prices were significantly higher. Now those have come down quite a bit over the last 5 years, but it's still making the U.S. just way more competitive from a feedstock perspective. And then Ohio, just already having a strong chemical manufacturing base, and now seeing that the Shale, the Utica, and the Marcellus being right here underneath our feet, the Shell cracker is happening. We continue to knock on wood that PTT Global makes a commitment. We've had a study done that shows that the region, I think, could handle up to 8 or 9 crackers. I think we would be content with the 2 and go from there. But yes, the price of natural gas, of our feedstock, is a huge driver in where folks look to locate. Now, that's one of many instances of what they're looking for when they're locating in Ohio. There's also infrastructure, logistics, permitting, and all those other things. And Ohio has said, we are open for business and we want industry to grow. So that has also been a big asset for our member companies and the industry in general.
Great. So I'm going to move back to Kevin, and this is a question about price forecasting in general and competitiveness of Appalachia versus other regions in the long term. So as we just talked about in the previous question, there's currently a price differential between our local regional price and kind of the national Henry Hub baseline price. And so what would be some of the, and we had talked about how increased interrelationships between those markets are going to bring the prices closer together. What would be some of the major factors that would change both your kind of price outlooks in terms of level and in terms of differences between the regions? And in the long term, how do you see the price competitiveness of the Appalachia region versus other regions, in particular the Southwest and the Gulf?
Okay, so there's a couple different aspects to this question. The first is price levels in general and what drives price levels in general. It's overall market growth and the cost of the supply to meet that market growth. And I think what has changed, the paradigm that has changed in North America over the last 10 years, if you remember 10 years ago, everyone was thinking that prices could be relatively high and volatile. And with the whole evolution of shale and tight oil resources and the cost of those resources being very competitive and relatively low compared to the conventional resources that were historically relied upon, the prices have come down. Now, market growth, overall level of market growth, is then what could place upward pressure on the prices as you necessitate or need more oil and gas development to meet that market growth. So the big risk going forward, I think, for gas and oil prices being relatively low is that market growth is relatively low. Oil prices are an important driver for gas prices as well, in that if you think about it, in many other parts of the globe, around the globe, gas is a substitute for oil in other markets. And so if oil prices are relatively low or depressed for some reason, global market growth is off, there's pricing dynamics within OPEC and around the globe that could keep the prices low, then gas prices would remain low as well, because again, gas is a substitute for oil in other markets around the globe. That's a good thing for consumers, as Jennifer pointed out. Certainly, chemical manufacturers are benefiting from those relatively low prices, and that will foster some market growth. Then the second question is about regional price dynamics and what's the difference between regional gas prices and what drives the level of differential between Marcellus and Utica prices and Henry Hub in particular. Pipeline development is very important there. Without pipelines being developed adequately to let that 42 BCFD of production out of the Marcellus and Utica that we project by 2025, then prices in the Marcellus and Utica would remain relatively depressed compared to prices elsewhere. In other words, if you saw significant regulatory delays on the pipelines weren't necessarily built, then those lower cost molecules can't move to markets elsewhere and create a little bit of uplift for the gas molecules that are being produced in the Marcellus Utica. So I think pipeline development's the most important parameter there for the price differential. And then finally, you get to, I think, your last question, which is how competitive is Marcellus Utica compared to production elsewhere? Very cost competitive. It's a prolific basin. We think there's over 1,000 trillion cubic feet of economically recoverable gas resource. Putting that in perspective, the basin produces, roughly 15 trillion cubic feet at present. So you have many years of supply potential there, and it's been the most prolific growth area in North America for natural gas production because those costs are very effective compared to costs elsewhere around the continent.
All right, great. Thank you very much. And we'll have one final question. And this is going to be, I would like to ask both Chris and Jennifer to respond. So as Kevin just clearly described, increased pipeline is going to bring the differential between Ohio and elsewhere down. The differential is going to decrease, and the Ohio price will go likely up towards the national Henry Hub price. So my question for Chris and Jennifer would be, how does this dynamic in changing the regional differential prices, how do you view this impacting both for Chris specifically, development of electric power generation through natural gas in the United States, and for Jennifer, use of natural gas as an input feedstock in the chemistry sector? So I'll turn it over to Chris first.
Well, I would suggest that as prices stabilize with more pipeline build out, that again, it incentivizes production of our resources here in the state and gives an outlet through power generation, at least in the state. With regard to the nation, I don't really have a lot of information about that, but at least here in the state with the 9,800 megawatts that we're tracking that may come online as a result, is very significant and would be very beneficial to not only producers and encouraging development, but also to consumers in Ohio.
Great. Jennifer, any comments?
Yes, and I'm going to echo, not to cheat out here and just echo what Chris said, but to some extent I am. And that price differential, you know, when a chemical facility builds here or expands here, you know, they've made a business decision that isn't based on 1 year out or 2 year out. They are looking at those price differentials for, you know, natural gas, what costs are going to be. These are things they've got to plan a 5, 10, 15, 20 year plan, build out. And so these, you know, I don't think that it's going to impact the growth we're seeing within the chemical industry, especially with this pipeline build out that we are seeing, as we talked about the Rover and the Spectra pipeline, of which we are supportive of both projects. As you continue to see that pipeline build out, you're seeing access to more of the resource. With the crackers, you're seeing access to more of the resource. So the price continues to be important, but there are other factors at play that I think continue to be beneficial to the chemical industry and will continue to see us grow here in Ohio.
All right, great. So it turns out that we are out of time, unfortunately, and so we'll have to end our Q&A there. Thank you again to all of our presenters, and we look forward to seeing everyone for our next webinar. Thank you.